Hey, I'm Jaimie.
And I'm Jay.
And today we're going to make a dice tower. So a dice tower is basically a box with a whole bunch of little pegs inside of it. You put the dice in the top, they clink around, come out the bottom, hopefully with a really awesome roll.
Yeah, it's a super cool thing to have at the gaming table. If you play a game that rolls a lot of dice, then this is a nice way to consolidate all your rolls into one place. The dice aren't falling off the table, they're not knocking over minis, and it's just cool. So our dice tower design is a riff on a design from the guys over at Geek Chic who made a super cool dice tower a few years ago. I've always loved that design, so we're going to try to build something similar, and we'll see how it goes.
All right, let's get started.
So taking a look at the plans here, we can see that there really aren't that many pieces. You've got 4 walls in the tower itself. You've got the 2 longer outer walls and then a front wall. And we've got a handful of smaller components like the tavern-style sign and the ramp inside that the dice roll out of. We'll start by milling up all our pieces, so we'll cross-cut what we want, then we can use a template to straighten out this line. And that way over at the bandsaw we can chop off that waste and end up with some nice straight grain for the towers. We're going to use the joiner here to get a nice straight board so that we can resaw it in half at the bandsaw. Another pass at the joiner straightens out that face, and then we send everything through the planer for final thickness. Table saw, we can rip these down to 4 inches, and then 2 inches for the smaller pieces. And on the crosscut sled, we'll true up one end of each piece, and we're going to set up a stop block so that we can crosscut these to their final length. We'll do the same thing with the skinnier pieces for the outer walls, and then the front wall gets measured to size and cut as well. Now that we've got all our pieces and they're cut down to the right size, the next thing is the joinery, which in this case is going to be miter joints. Those are 45-degree cuts that come together to make a 90-degree angle. There's a whole bunch of them in this project, so let's go ahead and cut those. With our table saw blade at 45 degrees, we'll rip the long grain miters on the tower wall pieces. For the smaller pieces, these are crosscut miters, so we're going to use a crosscut sled with a 45-degree setup. It's important at this step to take our time so that we really get right on the edge. If we go past it, it's likely to tear out the grain, which is going to result in a lot of sanding for us later. It's better to take our time here and do this really cleanly. A few quick passes with the hand plane at our shooting board, and this joint's going to go together perfectly. And the shavings are awesome. Next, we'll lay out which pieces are which, and we'll start drawing the door on the front of the tower. We measure 1.5 inches square, and then we can use a bendy something or other to draw a line. We'll mark out clearly where we're going to cut, and then with the bandsaw, we can cut our vertical lines, cut out the waste, and bring it over to the bench where we can use a coping saw to rough out the rest of that curve. At the belt sander, we can get rid of those saw marks and get a bit closer to the line. But to really dial this thing into final, we're going to use a hand file over at the bench. We can also use some sandpaper to clean up the vertical edges of the door. From there, the door should be in pretty good shape. Next, we'll tackle the outer wall pieces. These have a big notch in them that measures 1.5 inches in from the end and 3/4 inches down. We'll measure it with the combo square that line across, and then continue that line down the face of each piece so that over at the bandsaw we can cut it. We'll use the miter gauge to make sure our cut is perfectly square, and then we'll set our rip fence to exactly 3/4 inches and rip out the rest of that notch. We'll do that on each piece, and we'll be ready to move on. It's nice when things start to come together. For the battlements on these pieces, these measure 1/2 inch across, so we'll measure the top, we'll square those lines down the face, and then we'll set our gauge to 1/4 inch for the depth and mark that as well. On the front wall, we measure 1/2 inch all the way across, and we square those lines down. We're going to cut these on the table saw, but we want to make sure the lines are clearly marked so we know where to cut. It's surprisingly easy to cut in the wrong place even with all these marks, so we'll make sure they're clear. Back at the table saw, we're going to take out our combo blade and we're going to put in a rip cut blade. We'll see why this is cool in a minute. We'll set our depth of cut to exactly 1/4 inch above the crosscut sled, and then we can line up our pieces against the fence and with the flat tooth of the rip blade easily cut these battlements. The other blade we were using has an angled tooth, so this technique doesn't work as well. From here, a few minutes with a sharp chisel cleans it up and it's good to go. Now that we have all these pieces, we'll do a quick dry fit just to check it out, and it's looking pretty cool. But before we glue it up, we're going to pre-finish the inside of the tower since it'll be pretty much impossible to access once it's glued up. We're going to finish it with shellac, which is a super easy finish to use. It dries really quickly, and it'll be really good for this. We'll use a foam brush to apply the shellac. We'll let one coat dry for about 10 or 15 minutes. Give it a quick wipe with some 320 grit sandpaper, and then a second coat will do it for the inside. Once everything's dry, we're ready to glue up. We'll put all the pieces in line, and then we'll tape them together with some blue painter's tape, and then flip it over and apply the glue to the miters. I'm using a small craft brush here to make sure that the glue is nice and even. And when you put the pieces together, a small plastic straw helps get any squeeze out of that inside corner. We'll repeat this process for all of the miters until eventually getting to the end, and we'll seal the whole thing up with more blue painter's tape. This stuff is plenty strong to hold this thing together while the glue dries. The same process gets repeated for the outer walls. We'll tape them together, flip it, apply the glue, and then fold it up and tape it. I cut a little piece of scrap to help tape it together. You may have noticed I went a bit overboard with the glue on those joints and there was a ton of squeeze out, but luckily the plastic straw technique helps get all that squeeze out of that inner corner.
As awesome as miter joints are, they're not super strong because you're basically gluing end grain to end grain, and if you don't reinforce them somehow, they can come apart pretty easily. We're going to use something called splines, where we're going to cut a groove basically across the corner and put a contrasting piece of wood in there, so it's going to look badass and it's going to make it super strong.
The splines are cut on the table saw using a small jig that lines it up at a 45-degree angle. We're going to use that rip cut blade again because it has a flat top, so we'll set our depth of cut a nice clean groove in our jig, and then we can cut all the grooves by aligning the piece in here diagonally. We'll also repeat that for the two splines in the outer wall pieces. We'll use a set of calipers to measure the exact width of that groove, and then we'll take a piece of walnut over to the bandsaw and we'll rip it out to that exact width. We'll cross-cut it off with a handsaw, and from there it's a couple of quick swipes with a piece of sandpaper to make sure it fits nice and snugly. We'll mark off the rough size of it, and then we can use a handsaw to cut out the little triangles that we're going to use as the splines. Gluing these in is fairly straightforward. You want to apply glue to the groove and to the spline itself, make sure they're fitting nice and snugly, and that they're all the way in. Most wood glues say they need 24 hours to fully cure, but we let this dry overnight and it seemed totally fine. There's a few ways you can trim these. You can use a flush trim saw with some tape on the surface to protect it. You can also use a really sharp hand plane, which is just a lot of fun. It takes a little longer. Or my personal favorite, a super sharp chisel to pare it nice and flush and get a perfect surface.
Our next component is going to be the ramp that sits at the bottom of the dice tower, so when the dice get to the bottom, they roll out the door. This is a simple piece of wood angled and glued inside so that the dice roll out nicely.
We used walnut for the ramp to match the splines, and after ripping it down to size on the table saw to fit in there perfectly, it was time to make the angles. Since this isn't an exact 45 degrees, we couldn't cut it on the miter sled on the table saw, so we decided to do it by hand on the shooting board. We got the bottom angle looking pretty much what we wanted, and then held it up to mark the second one, and it was actually surprisingly pretty close to 45 degrees after all, so we cut off the waist, took it back to the shooting board, and gave it a standard 45 degree angle. When we put it in, it didn't quite fit, so we brought it back and put a piece of wood underneath it to bring the angle up to about 50 degrees, and after that it fit really nicely. We're not going to glue this in yet, but now we have a really nice fitting piece to use later.
Okay, so the next stage of this build is to put the dowels in the tower. Now the purpose of the dowels is so that when you put the dice in the top, they get kind of clinked around inside and they get randomized before they come out. So there's three things we got to think about. Make sure there's enough dowels in there so that a dice will always hit at least one and get randomized. 2, don't put so many dowels in there that the dice get stuck. And 3, we want to do this in a visually appealing way, right? So we don't want like 50 of them on one side and none on the other side, or we want to make sure it's balanced and that it looks really nice.
To make our dowels here, we're going to start with a 3/8 inch thick piece of walnut, and we're going to use that to set the width of the rip fence and then cut a piece that's the same width. This gives us a 3/8 inch square piece that we can put into a drill and then use a dowel plate to turn this into a round dowel. A piece of sandpaper makes it nice and smooth, and then like magic, we've got some walnut dowels. At the drill press, we'll use a 3/8 inch Forstner bit with a backer board clamped on to make sure we get some really nice clean holes. The position and the amount of the holes on each side is not critical because we can always adjust the length of the dowels inside to make sure the dice don't get stuck. For now, we just want it to look good. We had a tiny bit of tear out in the inside, so we cleaned that up with a chisel, and then it was on to getting the dowels ready. We took a towel and wrapped it around a piece of wood, and then taped a piece of sandpaper on there, and then we could drill the end of the dowels to make them nice and round on the end. With a handsaw, we cut a bunch of randomly sized pieces to match the number of holes we had, and and then we cleaned them up and put a coat of shellac on them so that they were nice and smooth and ready to install. While the finish was out, we did a couple of quick coats of shellac on the ramp using the same technique that we used on the inside of the tower. Gluing these dowels into these holes was honestly the hardest part of this whole project. First we had to decide where they were going to go, so we marked each dowel with a letter and then put some blue tape to mark the corresponding hole. And then we had to put some glue in the hole and then carefully reach inside and stick the dowel in there in the appropriate place. We left a little bit of space on the outside because we're going to fill those holes with a piece of brass. Back over at the table saw, we'll put our non-ferrous metal blade on, and we'll get the crosscut sled out. We're going to cut a bunch of 1/16 inch plugs from a 3/8 inch brass dowel. Whenever we cut these, we always end up with a little tab on the end of each of them. They sand off easy enough, but it's kind of a pain in the neck. To glue all of the plugs into the holes, all it took was a little dab of super glue and then to tap them into place with a hammer. Luckily they fit really snugly in these 3/8 inch holes. With all the plugs in and the glue dry, we were finally ready to start sanding.
Using brass and other soft metals in your woodworking is easier than you think. You can buy stock like this online for like a couple of dollars. I think this dowel was literally like $1. So just Google it. You can buy them on lots of different websites and get them shipped to you. Just make sure that if you're sanding or cutting metal that you're always wearing a mask and eyeglasses because the dust is brutal.
We started with 80 grit sandpaper because of the brass, and ended up going all the way to 220 with the random orbital sander, finished it out with a 320 by hand, and then burnished the surface with some hand plane shavings.
Okay, finally done sanding. That took like 10 times longer than I thought. Sanding those little brass pieces to get flush with the wood took like a million years because I didn't do a good enough job when I glued them in. They were kind of crooked and a little, not flush enough. I think I could have done a much better job putting them in. That would have saved me a ton of time, so I'll remember that for next time. But for now, we're ready to move on to the next step. For the finish on the dice tower, we're gonna use water locks, which protects super well. If you do the 3 coats like they recommend, then it really protects nicely against oils and spills and stuff like that. Not that the dice tower is gonna get wet, but it does constantly get picked up and moved around a lot at the dice table, and people might spill things or just have greasy hands and stuff like that. And you wanna protect it against things like that because it'll just last longer and it's worth it.
After cleaning up the surface with some mineral spirits to get rid of any latent sawdust, we used a foam brush to apply the first coat of water locks. This finish goes on really easily. You really only have to worry about making sure it's nice and even and that you don't have any drips. We ended up doing 3 coats, and each coat takes about 24 hours to cure, so it ended up taking about 3 days to get it all on, but it looks really, really good.
To make the sign that hangs in front of our dice tower, we're going to use a wet ink image transfer technique. Now typically we do something like a branding iron, but our logo is brand new and we haven't had a chance to give those made yet. But this method still gives you that really cool aged look. It's also super fast, easy to do. All you need is an inkjet printer and some freezer paper. So let's get started. First, let's prep the wood by roughing it up with sandpaper. This helps our ink sink into the wood better. Next, cut the paper out to match your printer. For us, that was 8.5 by 11. Freezer paper has a plasticky coating on it that helps the ink sit on top instead of soaking in. Once your paper's ready, let's take the image into Photoshop and get it ready for printing. We're going to resize the image so that it matches the size of our sign. We'll also make the canvas a little bigger. Lastly, we're going to mirror the image so that it prints out in reverse. We want the ink to be wet when we put it on the wood, so this next part we have to work pretty quickly on. We cut out the image to match the size of our sign and then carefully place it face down on the wood. We'll rub over the surface with something hard like a credit card to get the ink to soak into the wood, being really careful not to move the paper while we're doing this. Carefully peel the paper off, and hey, it worked! Now we're going to cut out the sign with a handsaw. The size here isn't really exact, it's just whatever looks best with your tower size. We're using a handsaw here because it's a small piece and a little delicate. Using a disc sander, we're going to round off the corners and smooth the edges. Now we're going to drill the holes where the sign's going to hang from. To hang the sign, we're going to use this small wire, so we'll cut a piece to length and then twist it up. We're using this wire because it's super easy to work with and it helps the sign stay in place, but you could just as easily use some twine or string. We'll trim off the excess and then color it with a Sharpie to make it look a little aged and not so shiny. We were originally going to use a round dowel for our signpost, but then we decided it'd look better square, so we are re-squaring up our dowel. We drilled some holes in our signpost and then threaded the wire through and bent it over on the top. The sign is done and worthy of a wicked tavern. Finally, we'll drill a hole for where we want the signpost to go.
Now that everything else was done and out of the way, it was finally time to glue in the ramp. Took a little bit of super glue on the sides and just put it right in place, and a clamp holds it in. To glue the outer wall component onto the tower itself, we also used super glue, so we applied a little bit onto the inside there, spread it around evenly with the brush, and then slid the tower in from the top and carefully put it into place. A couple of clamps and a few hours later, and it was all done.
Dude, that was awesome. That was so much fun to build.
That was definitely a lot of fun to build. It changed a little bit from our original design, but it came out really nice. I'm super happy with it.
Yeah, I can't wait to use it this weekend.
I think this is a tower truly worthy of an epic adventure.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. We had a ton of fun building this dice tower, and if you build your own dice tower, send us a picture. We'd love to see it. Be sure to subscribe to our channel. We have a lot more awesome videos coming up. Until then, stay wicked. I don't think I do with a handful of dice. You can't even see them. If you build a dice tower, send it to us. Okay. Woo! Hey everyone.